Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us here on the show, the Dave Emmons Show. And if it's evening or nighttime or daytime that you hear this show, I'm just glad to have you here. And the shows have been running one or two shows a week, and we have different people with different experiences and different academic backgrounds. And as you notice, if you follow the show, well, this is also syndicated through WDY Radio, and that's Odyssey Radio.live. That's Eddie Carson's in Maryland. So we take breaks at the bottom of the hour and the top of the hour for the radio station. So we're going to get right into this. And my guest today, and I know the name very familiar because I got a brother named Jay Hall, and he's got an MS, Master's of Science in Mathematics. He is a 10-year mathematics professor at Howard College in Big Spring, Texas. He has the master's degree in mathematics, and wow, mathematics is something I think I lost control of early on after high school. When I got to college, the math was just a pain, Jay, I'm telling you. But he's got 53 credit hours of science courses in various disciplines, so he wrote some books on this. He's got about 3 books out. We'll talk about those. He taught at the high school, the technical school, and community college levels. He's also experienced in the actuarial field, and that is insurance, of course, for a number of insurance and consulting organizations. Hall has previously published Fantastic Polygon Constructions and a paper on Math World, 1/7 Eclipse, HTTP mathworldwolfram.com. You'll see that. We'll post that on the posting. In addition, he's an author of Calculus is Easy. Yeah, for him, yeah. there's also a video on YouTube. Search Calc EZ. Look for the hammer. Hall is a proud member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. He was a journalist for a year and had the privilege of interviewing Maya Angelou. Wow, she's a poet, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So interesting background there, Jay. And I wanted to ask you, is there anything else you want to add to what you've done or what you're doing right now, that Mr. Jay Hall?
Yeah, just to clarify, I was at Howard College for 11 years, so I'm making a play on words where I was there at least 10 years, so 10-yeared in quotes.
Okay.
But I was actually there for 11 years, and I really enjoyed that. And so now I have more time. I'm semi-retired, more time to write books, and I look for speaking engagements, especially on my latest book, Biological Essentialism. So. And I would even be willing to do that via Zoom. So that's one thing that your audience may be interested if they want to learn more about that topic.
Right. I think they will. I'd like to learn more about it because I've never interviewed anybody with this topic, biological essentialism, and you'll have to explain that as we go along. I'm sure you're going to have some explanation, and being involved in mathematics, you have to be pretty good at whatever you do, and also journalism. That's my background too. So you've got a little bit of everything. So it's a kind of a good mix that you have here in writing your books. Could you tell us how you got involved in this to begin with?
Well, I've been interested in origins for quite some time, and of course, in school, I'd read like the Time Life books about the universe or the Earth and things like that, and say, there was the cosmic dust, and it collected and formed the solar system, and then little by little there was rain. Came to the earth, and then you have life forming kind of by accident, and that just seemed kind of odd to me. And then comparing to that to what we read in Genesis about, God said there was light and there was light. So trying to work through that contrast. And of course, in terms of American history, one key event was the Scopes trial in 1925. So that was one of my early published works where I tried to relate some of these things. The Darwinists would say that, and is that really true? And trying to apply some critical thinking to what we're taught about origins and evolution in public schools.
Right. Your book looks, the biological essentialism tackles Aristotle, undarwinism. I guess you don't believe in Darwin, right?
That's right. It's a contrast to the usual atoms to atom viewpoint that we usually hear.
Right. You say here human nature, worldview, bias, renegade scientist. I guess you're talking about scientists who are kind of coming in with all kinds of crazy theories. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, there are a number of scientists that have challenged various parts of Darwin and Wallace. There's an argument that Wallace actually came up with the idea, Alfred Russel Wallace, before Darwin. I actually would agree with that, but he actually did not apply it to humans. He knew that we're special. We're on a different level in terms of a Christian viewpoint. You know, we're made in the image of God, Imago Dei,
Right.
and even those that don't look at it that way, you know, we're creative. You know, we how many apes have built rocket ships to the moon? You know, that sort of thing.
Right.
So even a widespread of people from different perspectives understand that humanity is actually special and different than the other creatures.
Okay. So in Darwinism, you don't believe that humans were involved in that. How about the animal kingdom? Are they involved in the evolution in Darwinism?
Well, that would be the key feature that's different on the biological essentialism. So when Aristotle realized that different types of life reproduce after their kind, you know, a squid reproduces a squid and that sort of thing, that he was one of the early observers, the early scientists, and a lot of people tag him as one of the first scientists in terms of applying his observation, not just being a philosopher. That an essential type of life would include, of course, humans. A good example would be a horse, and that there's variation, yes, but yet that variation has limits. You can only breed corn so large. You can only breed it so sweet. Whatever it is we're looking at, you can a racehorse can only go so fast. No racehorse goes 75 miles an hour. Every kinds of basic creature has limitations.
Wow, that's something I never thought of. But yeah, you're correct on that. On this Dawkins versus Dawkins, what was that about?
Well, what we're looking at is different statements that he has made over time, because he even admits that if we look at the living world, it sure looks like it's designed. But, you know, he has a presupposition. And when he has to come up with tough answers like, okay, if I'm going to build a Lego that looks like a house, a Lego set, and put it together that looks like a house, I could do it with maybe 20 blocks. But if you've put together these that kind of look like these Star Wars battleships and so forth. I mean, there's so many pieces, and you got to go through the instructions. And I've just helped my cousin do it. Boy, is it complicated. Where you're adding information, and Dawkins himself doesn't really have an answer. Well, where did that new information come from? So on one side, he's very much pro evolution, but when it comes to the nitty gritty, he can't really explain it very well.
You talk about natural kinds and gender confusion and geology, among other topics. What is the gender confusion about? What are you saying in that?
Well, I'm holding to traditional aspects of the difference between men and women. And if you happen to have seen Matt Walsh's What is a Woman, that would be an excellent idea of what I'm saying, is that there are those distinctions. And it would even go to the point of not just your genetics, not just your psychology, but even to the point of your soul. I would argue that there's differences, because you could take the common examples like medicines for men versus women are different. And men, the Google guy that was let go because he said, you know what, women tend to go towards certain professions and men tend to go towards certain professions, and say computer programmers as a generalization tend to be more a male thing. And yeah, there are women chess champions, true, but in general, the higher end on math and say something like chess or engineering, certain professions are very, very much dominated by a certain sex, whether male or female. A lot of nurses, of course, are female, not that there aren't exceptions, but that these generalizations are real. It's not just socially constructed, as Jordan Peterson has said over and over again. I would very much agree with his way of looking at it.
Right. You know, during my lifetime, and it's been quite a long time, so I've seen, you know, most doctors back when I was in the 50s and 60s, they were mostly all men. And starting in the 70s, the late 70s, 80s, 90s, women started going to med school. And then you have more and more. As a matter of fact, the best doctors I've ever had were women, to tell you the truth.
True, true.
Yeah,
And
they are.
yeah, in terms of the bedside manner and showing some care and concern individually, there's no doubt about that. I would totally agree with that aspect of it.
Right. I just had a doctor that was I called her the best I've ever had. And she was very thorough, very nice, very intelligent. Now she moved up into management, and now I lost her. but I have to say that there's been a big change in women and men throughout the years, and what jobs are taking. There's a lot of women that are going into construction, and 20, 30, 40 years ago, I never saw it, but now you see the changes going on.
Right, right. So I'm talking about generalizations. I've
Right.
done part-time out in the oil patch, and a very few women truck drivers out in the oil patch. Very few. It's kind of an icky environment, and just from that aspect, a lot of women won't even go there.
Right. What we're doing, we're talking about your book, Biological Essentialism Tackles, it's biological essentialism is basically the title of the book. And I'm going down your notes and your profile here. The controversial work is fully illustrated with hundreds of graphics, and innovative ideas are well documented with over 500 references and notes. Biological essentialism holds that there exist essential types of life, ETLs, such as bears and penguins. These are distinct kinds of organisms that do not have a common ancestor, or organic variation has limits. So that covers the book pretty well. Anything more you want to say about that book?
Yeah, I would say that I basically try to come up with three key examples, and that would be horses, hydras, and humans. So with horses, you have zebras, and in the fossil record, you have some that have three toes. But just like with a people, there are some people even in modern times that have been born with six digits on each hand, six digits on each foot, and survived. There was a young kid in San Francisco a few years ago that was born like that. And so there's variation with humans on the digits, and why not horses? And so I include the fossils, horses that we find with more toes, and the horse essential type of life. And sometimes if you're looking this up online, you might use a natural kind. There's various words that would parallel mine, but I think essential type of life is a term that I think would fit. But in terms of the phrase biological essentialism, when you do a search on that, you kind of have to separate it away from some of these what's called like racial issues and also the gender issues. But the historical definition and the academic definition is exactly what I'm talking about. And of course, a hydra is basically like a cup, and it has tentacles on the top. And so it doesn't have an outlet, it only has an inlet. So that's about the most basic kind of a creature you can have, but yet the evolutionists can't really explain where it came from, or what it would have evolved to in the evolutionary tree of life. And then of course humans are special due to our communications, our academic aspects, and our hope of an afterlife.
So the octopus is also is that what you're talking about? Is kind of like a hydra with that, or is that a squid type of animal?
Well, a lot of them are microscopic. Some of them you can just barely see, but it basically looks like a tube, and the bottom there has a bottom to it, so it's like a cup in that sense. And then at the top, there's little tentacles that sting other things that it eats and can bring it to its mouth. But it's about the most simplest kind of creature you could even imagine.
Right.
And yet there's no variations that we see in the fossil record or living things that it could possibly be turning into something else. So it's real easy to get the idea of what it is, but yet it doesn't seem to come from anything or go to anything else that's a different essential type of life.
Right. I guess going against Darwinism, scientists, I just mentioned the octopus, they still haven't figured that out. They think that creature is alien to our planet. Is that true?
Wow.
Do you know anything about that?
Well, I mean, they have their ink sac. They have where they can change color. They're just such a wild creature. And in terms of things that often mainstream science that you should apply some critical thinking and be willing to hear some new scientific ideas, or sometimes they use the term alternative. But, in terms of the giant squid and things like that, we've now learned so much more about that. I'm always interested in hearing some ideas. But I would say, I'm holding to the more traditional view, because even say like Augustine had this idea, which I think was influenced by Aristotle, because we know from entropy the things break down, and so the universe is not completely collapsed. So there must have been a beginning. So because this is where I think Augustine got a little his idea from. So if everything happened at a focus point, say at the beginning, I'm basically putting all the basic types of life at the same time. That's essentially what I'm arguing for, which again, in the biblical sense, would be in Genesis, where it speaks of the creation week.
Right. So you're saying that man is created by God, and that was
Yes.
outside of the Darwinism. And let's go into this. I know you have the UFO syndrome. We'll go into that a little later.
Okay.
I'm an ET guy, you're myself, I'm
Yes.
interested in getting in that part of what you want to talk about. But the let's go into this other book. Is a young Earth possible? How does popular science and history support a youthful world? And what do you mean by young Earth? It's not that old. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so I'm arguing for thousands of years, not billions or millions. And of course, this developed over time within, say 1900 to 1940 something. We basically had some, well respected scientists in the mainstream, so to speak, that it was just a handful of millions of years old for the entire history of the Earth. 100 million would have been a common number if you just had to pick something. And of course, Kelvin made the argument related to the heat of the Earth that in the sixth edition of Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, he completely changed it. It hardly gets any attention because Darwin basically kind of almost completely flipped, almost in his sixth edition. It has many, many differences. But basically, he caved in to Kelvin because Kelvin was a extremely well-respected physicist. So over time, the discovery of radiometric dating and that thing decays, different things decays, uranium and so forth, rubidium, strontium, you have all these different methods. But one of the initial investigators, John Jolly, who actually helped develop some of the radiation treatments in terms of like his healthcare, he noticed that for different methods, if you use this uranium method or use this other lead method, that you got different dates for the same rocks. Right. So he actually kind of gave up on the idea. So over time, the date has changed from, say, 100 million to 4.5 billion that we accept now. So I'm just saying that change over time could make you wonder, does the whole thing depend on radiometric dating, which I say is not so reliable.
Right. Now, I know they're talking about, and I believe this too, I've seen it on documentaries, that we humans have been here and gone through catastrophic chaos or whatever, floods or whatever. We've been here and gone many times in the past millions of years. Are you thinking the same way?
Well, I'm taking a more traditional viewpoint. There's some overlap. Like I have a lot of respect for like the magazine Atlantis Rising. Those people put together a book, Forbidden History, and in one chapter they talk about the global flood. So what I'm saying is I'm taking some of the historical things like the Mayan calendar and saying that that's a cycle after cycle. I'm saying that when they put a beginning, say roughly, I forget what it's 3,500 BC, I forget the exact date, that's not that far off, and that you can reinterpret the Babylonian king list. And instead of these humongous thousands and thousands of years for the rain, that if we look at our number system, we base it on 10, but the Babylonians based it on 60. That's why we have 60 degrees, and how we work the circle is 360, and how we have the time, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. That all goes back to the Babylonians. So if you do a little translation from base 60 and reverse it back to base 10, you almost have roughly a 6,000 year history going on. So I'm saying a shorter history going back to the more traditional younger Earth concept that we had, say, in the early days of science with like Kepler and people like that.
There's some stories. We're speaking to the Jay Hall. He's got a master's, and he's a mathematician. He's a scientist now, and he's doing a lot of research. He's got these 3 books that we're talking about today. Is a young Earth possible? Now, I've been hearing, like through ufologists and things of this nature, archaeologists, they're saying that 60,000 years ago, the modern human was developed, and it was developed by the Anunnaki. Of course, that's an alien race. So in Sumeria, do you know anything about the starting of the modern human race in Sumeria? Have you done any study on that?
Well, I think you have to put the center of that civilization. So I'm agreeing to that extent. But I'm saying that the initial people, Adam and Eve, were quite smart and able to build a civilization from scratch. Of course, that took some time. And then you have roughly around 1,600 years. And then, of course, quote unquote, eating the apple and bad things happening. And that you have the civilization and, of course, influence from demons, the Nephilim, this sort of thing, that you have a judgment from God at the time of the global flood, which, you have cultures all around the world that have this great catastrophe. So I'm just saying that I think there was one, not multiple. And then the traditional landing place in Noah's Ark, is in Ararat. So that's all in the same place. And you have those great pillars in Turkey that have the carvings of the various animals. Well, again, what are we looking at? We're looking at biological essentialism, that this big barge had tons of animals on it, and that, helping them to grow and survive and thrive. That's a very important thing because, we, in contrast to the vegans, I'm all for eating meat, that, having cattle and other animals that we can survive with, and that's an important aspect. But I'm trying to revise the date, and an aspect that we can do that with is because we now have somewhat of a timetable based on our DNA, more DNA that we're getting from around the world, and then put a timetable to that by the mutation rate.
Right. Now, you're from Oklahoma and Texas. Of course, meat is very essential there, right? That's the cattle, the meat. Jay, you mentioned you cover Eisenhower, free speech, astronomy, and the Magnificent Seven, depression, and much more. And don't let the mega education complex choke the truth. Where do you want to start on it? How about Eisenhower? What's going on there?
Yeah, well, I've heard different stories because I've tried to trace this down. And on Eisenhower's famous speech about the military-industrial complex,
Right.
and one of the main Fox News hosts, I think he delved into it a little bit in one of his books on Eisenhower. But the thing is what was his original speech like? Did it include science, education, and the academics? And so, in other words, there's a whole big cabal in terms of you don't get funding from the National Science Foundation unless you kind of fit the traditional mold and follow along with what the elites essentially want you to say. So I actually have it in my book about, because I met a National Science Foundation person that worked there when I went to a math conference in New Orleans. And then they related me to somebody else who would be the right person to contact. And basically, officially, they say, oh, yeah, if there's research that argues for this young Earth position, yeah, we're totally okay with that and open to it. But yet there's been various situations, like some scientists that are similar minded like myself that have tried to get rock samples from the Grand Canyon. They actually had to go to court to get their rock samples.
Yeah, they there's a lot of secrets there, right? There's a lot of, they said there's some Egyptian, I guess, uh, a background there. They found Egyptian artifacts and things of that nature. Is that true?
Well, I think that was something that might have been related to the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I'm of the opinion there's an older book, maybe published in the 70s. It's something like they all discovered America, something along those lines. There was a cleric who went from England, I think, in an extremely simple boat, and maybe he just hugged the coastlines and wound up in Nova Scotia or something. But that's one about the simplest way. And of course, it's sad that many younger people have no idea who Thor Heyerdahl was. And, he traveled in a reed boat across the Atlantic, and then a Polynesian style boat to somewhere, I forget exactly where, maybe Fiji, and then went to South America. So in terms of people that have actually done it in modern times and the ancient records that this have happened, Oklahoma has its rune stone. I believe that's authentic, of a Viking source. And there's many things throughout the whole country, the Japanese on the West Coast. I think the evidence is super strong that many, many cultures have discovered America other than Columbus.
I believe so too. It's like even the Knights Templar, the Spanish in 1200 or I guess 1100 AD in Oak Island. That the documentary they have there. You mentioned also uh, the depression and the, I guess, free speech. And then also you mentioned academia. What does that mean? That means that they're withholding information from us, you think?
Well, I think there's the idea of a shadow banning because some of my things I think are that way. In other words, I count my connections. I have tons of them, but yet when I get reposts or likes and so forth for some of my posts, often I don't get, much more over 100. I think my most famous video has maybe 1,200 views. But the point is, YouTube generally isn't known as being friendly towards kind of alternative ideas or things, ideas on the edge,
Right.
and that sort of thing. So in terms of absolutely free speech, I think there's some obvious things with, say, climate skeptics that have been crunched down, and many things related to the corona crisis, of course. And now that's kind of been vindicated. Atlantic had that article about can we have a pandemic amnesty? Well, why weren't they listening to these alternative voices that were able to come up with effective treatments for the COVID?
Right. Well, yeah, you talk about shadow banning, and believe me, brother, I know all about that, Jay. That's one of the things I know about too. But I think we discussed the facts, and I think what you're talking about, uh, that's it's coming out. It's the facts. They're talking about amnesty for this COVID situation, and I hope they don't hold us to that on this platform because it's the truth. They've been talking about it the last month or two. Isn't that right, Jay?
Yes, and the thing is I'm trying to bring it down to make a comparison with Nuremberg, and that would have some overlap to some of the UFO experiences because, again, I don't knock what people have experienced. It's kind of like, what's the deeper meaning behind it?
Mhm.
So if I got, quote unquote, abducted and something happened to my insides, and now I have two hearts like Doctor Who or something. Well, did I give permission for a medical operation? And anything needs to be, if someone's giving me a treatment, I need to be agreeable to it. I can't be in some experiment that doesn't have justifiable reason. Think of 9 months. It takes 9 months to bring a baby to term. Did
Right.
we take 9 months to test these treatments? No. How do we know it's not going to cause birth defects? I mean, that's just something a child of 3 could understand.
That's
So
just
those are the
yeah.
things I'm talking about.
That's what, like with any medication, you see the medication out there for 10 years, and then all of a sudden on TV, you say, if you've taken this medication for the last several years, then call this lawyer. There's enough of that going around. We're down at the bottom of the hour, Jay, and I'm speaking, to Jay Hall. He's got a master's in math as a mathematician, also a scientist, and he's written 3 books. We're talking about them. We're also syndicated through WDY Radio, and that's Odyssey Radio.live. And that's my buddy Eddie Carson's there in Maryland. And this is the Dave Emmons Show, and we will be right back. Okay, we're right back. It only takes a few seconds for the 2-minute break for the radio. We're doing this for radio, and I explain that to people all the time. They think, well, why did they go quiet verbally? Well, we're actually going at the bottom of the hour for a 2-minute break. This is the Dave Emmons Show, and we're syndicated through WDY Radio, and that's Odyssey Radio.live, and that's Eddie Carson's in Maryland. And he's syndicating the show here, and he's doing the audio portion, and we're doing the video portion. I'll have the video portion out tomorrow on this show, Jay. So that I just told my guest, when this is going to be released. So I usually release them pretty quick, but I try not to stack them, because people, they have to have a chance to see the last video that I put out. So yeah, we got to give them some little time. Can't squeeze them too much out there. But my guest is Jay Hall, and he's a scientist, mathematician, in masters, and he's written these 3 books that we're talking about today. He's probably had other articles. He's got YouTube things going on. So let's talk about Jay Hall. Let's talk about, yes, the Young Earth Science. That's the 3rd book, I guess, in this series. And you said, what is the Young Earth? And then you agree with it. You asked the question in the other book, and now you're saying yes. Okay, could you explain that?
Sure. It's an idea that it's supported by history and science and philosophy. I go into all kinds of directions. I'm just trying to keep it simple with a nice acronym, Young Earth Science. And sometimes that Young Earth idea, that's flat Earth, right? No, two different things, and people get it confused. So basically, I'm arguing that there is evidence for the Young Earth perspective. And even Lucretius, the philosopher, talked about, we have all these inventions that we've come up with. Well, if the Earth had been around for so long, even though he wrote a good while ago, that almost like we'd be at the point of the Jetsons. I mean, that's kind of, I'm simplifying his argument. And then look at the Trojan War. There's that neat movie, Troy, and you have Homer's writings. And so we have this great event that happened, and it took a while before the archaeologists from the late 1800s actually unraveling where Troy was, and taking it that Homer, it wasn't just all these fanciful things. There's a core that's very, very, very historical, and so that happened. Well, I would say that humans and Neanderthals are all part of the same group, the same, going back to what we were just talking about, essential type of life. And if you do your 23andMe or go through ancestry.com and get your DNA analyzed, most people will be between 3% and 6% have a Neanderthal DNA in themselves. So what are the great tales of what the Neanderthal did? If you happen to have seen the movie 10,000 BC, was it like that? So I make the argument from various sources that the Earth can be very young, and that can fit with actual history and actual science.
Right. I I just had a thought in my mind about all this, about how old the Earth is. It's a lot older than what we think, and you're saying it possibly could be younger, and that the rocks were formed more rapidly, and so the dating systems that we have, like carbon dating, now nuclear dating, radiometric dating methods, you said, are if they're reliable or not. Uh, I was just thinking that how do we know for sure what's really going on, Jay?
Well, I'm a traditionalist in that sense. So I'm saying that I am a Christian. I'm born again, and I believe Scripture. But I also believe that we can go out into the world and see what God has created. In the book of Job, it talks about speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and speak to the animals, and they will help you understand. And that there's a scientific aspect, and we can pick up clues. And one obvious one is the moon gets a little bit farther, gets a little bit farther. And so if you backtrack that, eventually it's going to get close and close and close to the Earth. And there's such a thing as the Roche limit, where the gravitational force of the bigger object will break up the smaller object. You have that. And so even mainstream scientists roughly put that at about 2 billion years related to the Earth-Moon system. Whereas, the origin of the moon is often there's a great collision with the Earth and things along these lines. But I'm just saying that's something that even for mainstream science, it doesn't quite match their predictions. So basically, I compile a whole bunch of those from cultural aspects, and where we do have some kind of a chronology. We have King's lists. They only go back so far, roughly say to 2000, 3000 BC. And in terms of the Egyptian one, the main trick on that is some of the lists come from, I think, like a Greek version, and actually there's a whole bunch of overlaps, and you have co-regencies that shrink the often stated Egyptian dynasty list to a lot further back than that. But actually, I think that you can interpret it in a shortened form.
Right. I just finished the text version of the Angels and Watchers and Other Supernatural, and I got into the Adam and Eve thing, and there you're in Genesis, and they were talking about Adam and Eve, and then the serpent, in which, of course, ufologists say that was a reptilian. They are the evil of the earth. Uh, this happened 600 years. The Garden of Eden happened 600 years before the Great Flood. Noah was supposed to be 961 years old when he finally died, and of course his Enoch and his Methuselah, his relatives, were actually older than him when they passed, but they didn't really pass. They disappeared. They went up to heaven, they said. So, did we live longer back then, or what was it all about?
Yeah, so you have, because this relates to the other issue of, kind of what if there wasn't a fall? So you have from basically living forever, seems like, and then going down to say like Methuselah, 969 years, and then going down. So the expanded lifetimes were because Adam and Eve had perfect genetics, and then little by little through chemical things or interactions with the environment, things went down, 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 and this took some time. And part of the curse, in other words, the punishment from the fall and Adam and Eve rejecting, uh, staying away from the knowledge of good and evil, the tree,
Right.
the fruit that was on there, that took some time to accomplish. But then the whole environment changed, and now you're down to 8 people. And so when we have 8 people, Noah, his sons, and his wife and their wives, 8 people altogether, that narrows down the genetics. So obviously, uh, Noah was picked because of his moral character and his devotion to the Lord. So it wasn't, and it could have been he had slightly better genetics. I'm not discounting that possibility. But in terms that all 8 of them were the 8 most perfect genetics of the earth, I don't think so. In
Yeah.
other words, Shem picked the pretty girl that was in his neighborhood, and so forth. So the genetics were limited, and then after that, the environment was kind of bad because you had this great catastrophe, and maybe say the magnetic field wasn't as strong, so we got more rays that caused the mutations.
Yeah. I guess there's a lot of, they said that God changed this because of the original sin that occurred, and humans went from living 1,000 years and then down to about 70 years. Or back then, it was only about 45 years in the ancient times. Actually, our life expectancy has risen somewhat. Now they lowered it by 2 years. Did you hear about that? Here about a month ago, yeah,
I have not.
yeah, they actually have lowered it. They went from, I think it was a 76 for a man, 78 or 79 for a woman, and now they lowered it down to 74, 75 for a man. But they claim that it's the drugs and the alcohol that's causing a lot of the people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s to pass away earlier. So that's what lowered our average age. But if you don't do drugs or drink a lot of alcohol, you might live a little bit longer. But going back to Noah, from what I studied from the book of Enoch, if you are you into Enoch? I mean, you probably know about the book.
I've heard a lot of people reference it. That's on my to-do list to do a little more research on that. But I've heard a lot of people give positive aspects that that's a good place to find out about the early Earth and some of the history.
Yeah. Well, they said that Noah didn't do anything. He was very unaccomplished, I guess, before the flood. And then they said God picked him to put this vessel together. Of course, my thoughts are that it wasn't all animals on the ark, Noah's ark. It was actually genetics. It was actually DNA from all these animals, because it'd be difficult to get two of every kind on that boat. But they said that Noah was about 6'2", 6'4". He was light complected, blonde hair. He had piercing blue eyes, and he didn't look like the Middle Eastern during that time. So here we go with the ufologists saying, well, Noah was probably an ET because Enoch and Methuselah, they went straight to heaven after a while. We're getting into the ET part of it, I guess. Now, what do you think about that? I mean, uh,
Well, I would agree that Enoch went up to heaven, but I think that's more to be with God. I would look at it in that sense. And the idea of Noah, I think that he gives his chronology of, is it Lamech was his father, if I'm remembering correctly. So I would take that when you have Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, you have the detailed when so and so was so old. Adam had Seth, and then when Seth was so old, he had that. So you actually have a pretty tight chronology from the way I would look at it. And then in the New Testament talks about Enoch was the 7th from Adam. So it actually says there's no gaps whatsoever. Enoch was the 7th from Adam. When you go grandfather to grandfather and you tie it all together, there's some clues like that. So even Augustine, when he's arguing with other philosophers, says, that the Earth has to be less than 10,000 years, just doing rough numbers with the chronologies that are in Genesis.
right. They're saying that the Great Flood was around 11, 12,000 years ago. That's what they're saying. But a lot of I guess, actually biblical scholars and scientists, archaeologists are saying we don't we don't really know the years. It could be 12,000, it could be 20, 40,000 years ago. So these stories, actually, some of mythology and everything like that, but the stories written in the Bible, there's no time stamp on them. And these are stories that were passed down from generation to generation, of course. So that's where a lot of scientists and biblical scholars are coming to a conclusion that they don't know exactly when these stories occurred. All they know is that there is written word, and it's in the Bible, that states that that did happen. But when, the Bible never says. Do you agree with that, Jay?
Well, I would hold to the more traditional thing. I think Usher, who gets criticized a lot, was fairly close to the right aspect. And in terms of more evidential aspect, if you look at all of the king lists, where it's actually tied together, not necessarily a story about the past, but where you said this king reigned this long, this king reigned that long,
Mhm.
and you put all those together, you do wind up to around 2000 or 3000 BC. And because I think man is smart, in other words, Noah had, I would agree, there were a lot of things on the ark, but Noah had this accumulated knowledge that he carried down, and that whether that was in scrolls or books or carved into sticks or stones, I'm not sure, but that he was an awful smart cookie, and that right away the people, there's I think the Tower of Babel really happened, that relates to our different cultures because God intervened and split the languages. So I would say that our ability to create civilization is fairly quick. And a good example of that would be, say, the mutiny on the Bounty and
Right.
on Pitcairn Island. They were able to create a civilization fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm. Now we're talking to Jay Hall, and he's a mathematician and also a scientist. We're talking about biological essentialism. That's his one book. We're talking about is a young Earth possible? And then now, yes, young Earth is possible. He comes up with a kind of a solution in this other book. Now, one last question on those books: Darwin's Dystopia, Globalism, Soylent Green. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you look at the predictions, of course, there's H.G. Wells, Things to Come, pretty depressing. I have not read the book. I've only seen the movie. But yeah, a pretty depressing aspect of what's going to happen. But it's almost like reading today's headlines. The Hunger Games, 1984, Fahrenheit 451. There's a whole bunch of these things. And of course, in Soylent Green, it's people. And you say, well, that's kind of crazy. Well, there's talk now to take some of the human remains and use them as fertilizer. So the next corn cob you get is Uncle Freddie in it. I don't know,
Yeah,
but I mean, we're getting closer and closer to
right,
Charlton Heston and Soylent Green.
right. We're running out of fertilizer, actually, aren't we? That could be the I guess the bring on for this the human fertilization. All right, let's go into my favorite topic, the UFO syndrome, deceptions from the ET. Could you tell me what you think about that?
Well, before I was a Christian, I was interested in the occult and things along those lines, but didn't really get involved. I never messed with a Ouija board or anything like that. But I picked up George Adamski's book. I believe it was Where He Goes to the Moon, if I recall correctly, because he goes to the moon, supposedly, and then Mars and Venus. Now, he's one that, from what I've been able to catch, is maybe more widely regarded now as maybe somewhat of a fraud. But we've been to the moon. We've had probes to Mars and Venus, and nothing kind of quite matches up. Now in Venus, you have the sulfuric acid, and it's not a nice place. But it's interesting. Science fiction's interesting because I'm saying there's a loop here, a feedback loop. You have interesting science fiction stories, but then that's connected back to Darwin often. And then that inspires what people are maybe looking for or thinking. And then you have people that have had real experiences. Again, what they mean and how we're going to look at them, we can get into. But these things kind of go in circles. And so what I'm saying is that if we try to make sense of all this, is that Darwin tells us a bad future and people treating people like animals. And if you look at Galton, the relative of Darwin, I'm trying to remember his full name. Darwin, yeah, Darwin's his last name. I think Galton's his middle name. I'm trying to remember his first name. But he wrote The Next Million Years. I think that was published in the 50s. maybe early 60s. But he goes on to what we have today. There's the rich and the poor. There has to be some kind of dominant government and control everybody to keep order. Sometimes we're going to have to force people to do things, maybe even related to psych medications. And so it's almost like reading the headlines. If you read The Next Million Years by, I think it's Galton, Darwin of the middle and last names. I'm trying to remember his first name, but read that book and it's pretty scary.
Right. Yeah, it's globalism is what we're talking about getting to, right?
Yes.
Yes, that's it. Now, alien as savior, is this a false flag type of thing?
Well, even the NASA programs and the SETI programs are almost, it's an underlying theme. And I think it's Stephen K. Dick has a book published by Cambridge Press and about what's the future of the ET whole thought. And basically, we think of what the biology might be like on a planet, say, with twice the gravity. Maybe the creatures look different. Or what type of bacteria might be, you know, in another galaxy. There's whole people that study that. It's a whole academic thing. So you might use that word exobiology. You know, what is the biology like out there and what can we learn about it, even if we have to speculate? Well, what about exo-religion? And so Stephen Dick talks about that if we find a superior race, they're going to give us the answer. They're going to tell us how we can become, you know, maybe one with the universe or learn the secret of life if it's not 42 for Douglas Adams. You know, what's the real truth that's out there? And then he posits the idea, well, obviously, if they're a superior technology, what about the civilization that's even more superior to them? Do they have the true religion? Almost like there's no end to it.
Right. Yeah, it just goes around and around and around. And Jay, you mentioned Alf and evolution and Spock rocks biological essentialism. What do you mean by that?
Right. So there's the serious science fiction like Arthur C. Clarke and Space Odyssey 2001. One of my favorites from Clarke is Rama. I really, really enjoy that. And that's the sort of things I'm reading now. That's the serious science fiction is Pillar to the Sky. If we had a cable up to space, we could have permanent solar energy.
Right.
And then a really wild one is about I'm trying to think Kraken. It has the word Kraken in it, but it's about artificial intelligence and basically what if AI takes over the world. You know, that's the way it always is. The robots take over the world. But then you have the other side of it, like Alf. Oh, it's a friendly guy. You know, of course he's a puppet and this sort of thing. He's our friend.
Right.
But yet there's one episode where he talks about his god Barry, and it's got, you know what? Again, it's supposed to be funny, but the point is it has all these weird elements in it that it's almost like a subtle brand washing. You know, UFOs could be great and our friends.
Right. Yeah, but there's also stories of a false flag that they could come down here, and the globalist I would say, well, this is an attack from the ETs, and that'll bring us all together and then create a one world organization just from that false flag. And actually, NASA has mentioned that too, I believe. I'm not sure. I guess I don't want this platform to hold me to that, but I'm not sure if that's been talked about or that's been talked about outside of it. I'm not really for sure. Have you heard anything on that part of it?
Well, you have the famous speech from Reagan that when he's at the UN talked about if we did have an outside threat like an ET, wouldn't that bring the world together where we could cooperate?
Right.
And I think that we've had this COVID experience, and I've been shocked through the whole thing. Maybe the first 2 or 3 weeks I was a little confused myself. I'll make a confession, but then over time I thought, hold it, you know, this isn't quite adding up. And then start listening to some other voices and the alternative media, and it began to make sense. So I think if I'm no prophet or the son of a prophet, but I would almost make it as a strong likelihood that some type of, like you say, false flag type UFO thing, maybe using, you know, high-tech military secrets and technology that could be used to help push for a one world government, you know, as they say, a new world order and the Great Reset, etc.
Yeah, the military industrial complex. Right. You mentioned C.S. Lewis a while ago in the space trilogy. What I guess he was he involved with Spock and Alf? You mentioned his name.
No, that's kind of, I'm moving on to the next step. In terms of Spock, the actor himself, Leonard Nimoy, I have tremendously respect, fantastic work ethic. And of course he did In Search Of, There's an In Search Of episode on Noah's Ark. There's one on genetic engineering that it's like, hey, this was made way back there, but his aspect about genetics that kind of fits in very, very well with my concept of biological essentialism, that life varies, yes, but like Darwin's finches, hey, they're finches, they just bigger beaks, slightly different shaped beaks, but they're all finches. That fits very well. And that him as an actor, he was willing to participate in shows that were willing to look at, well, what about this? What about that? Atlantis, or et cetera, Bigfoot, da 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 da. So the actor himself was willing to think about things that were maybe a little bit out of the mainstream. So I'm applauding him for that. In terms of C.S. Lewis, his space trilogy, I have a great respect for, and that's the 3 books: Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength. Those 3 books are his space trilogy.
Wow. I mean, these people have some insight and some, I guess, they can see the future coming. Mork's Divine Revelation. What was that revelation, real quick?
Well, in Mork and Mindy, again, another silly show, but again, it gets you, hey, this UFO guy can be my friend, and nothing to fear here, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so it kind of puts those ideas in your mind in almost the subtle way, even though it's humor. And so that's one general aspect. And did he come and say, oh, maybe you ought to concern yourself about where you go after you die, or maybe you ought to investigate the Bible, or these sort of things, or you never get into that. But there was this character on there that had 2 key aspects: Exodore, and then he talked about the Venusians are going to take us away, and you need to join our little cult group, and that sort of thing. So almost like that was about the time of Jim Jones and Drink the Kool-Aid and all that. And then so Mort kind of gets into it full load. And then once he kind of gets a taste of what does this all involve, and this guy seems to be a little mentally off, and then he gets out of it. So sometimes we're gullible for the latest thing, and we get all into it, and then we're not applying our critical thinking. And then what does this apply? And our conscience, hey, how do we initially respond to something? Is this really what it seems to be? And then Exodor's second religion was O.J. Simpson and football. And of course that had to change. Now we look at O.J. Simpson in a different light nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've been hearing that Hollywood, like Spielberg and people like him, get advance notice from our military and people that he might know, because they're in that higher echelon, the elite. And that some of these ideas are actually real, except that the producers expand upon them in movies. We're actually seeing the future. We're actually seeing what's going on now. Do you believe that, Jay?
Yes, of course. There's the classic, Dr. Strangelove and Kubrick and these sorts of things. So I think just to throw in a hobnob with the stars. My wife used to work at the base in Fort Worth, and one time she got to meet Tom Cruise. Hey, that was pretty cool. Really? And of course, as they always say, he's shorter in real life. But the point is, everybody, like on social media, 6 degrees of separation. So one of them may be willing to tell you a few things. And of course, there's really wild shows like Stranger Things, which is like, that just absolutely blows my mind.
Yeah, we're closing in. I got a couple of things here. You got down written in your notes, and I want to ask them, how do we cure the UFO syndrome? And what if Adam and Eve go to Proxima B? Those 2 things.
Yeah. So in terms of the cure, I'm saying that Christians that are dedicated, that have kind of had these issues and the troubling aspects with these encounters, if they're singing or maybe reading the Bible, or they just ask Jesus to help them out loud, things along these lines, it basically gets rid of these disturbing encounters. And it's just basically in conjunction with the promise: draw near to God, he'll draw near to you; resist the devil, he'll flee from you. So that to me is the cure, that it's a spiritual battle, and that you have to realize there are evil forces out in the universe.
Yes, there is a battle. Yes.
Yeah. And then on the second aspect of it, and that's kind of the thing where the C.S. Lewis books come into play. So as a matter of speculation, because I believe God has a plan, It says God declares the end from the beginning in Isaiah. And so I do believe that. But in terms of an interesting speculation, if Adam and Eve had not eaten the apple, so to speak, they would have lived forever, had a bunch of kids, Earth would have filled up. They would have had to gone extra solar and explore other places. And
Right.
so the planets would have filled up, the ones that are habitable and so forth. Adam would have had to figure out, how to invent an antimatter rocket and so forth. So in terms of exploring the whole universe, that's another option.
Right.
And I've heard for the way we have now, the carrying capacity for the Earth is around 60 billion theoretically.
Wow. Okay, we're about ready to close up. I want to just make mention of the 3 books that we're talking about. Is A Young Earth Possible? And yes, Young Earth Science, and then Biological Essentialism. And tell them where they can find your sites on the internet. Jay, this is Jay Hall.
Sure. My main site is totalyouth.us, totalyouth.us. And in terms of what I was talking about, C.S. Lewis, if you just plug in the 3 words, Adam's Lost Dream, and then go to the search box and either search the word population or lost in space, it'll bring up my thoughts about what I think about C.S. Lewis and some of his science fiction writings.
Okay, and great. And people pick up on these 3 books we talk about. You've been listening to the Dave.
That's right. The links are on Total Youth.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. And let's just go ahead and listen to this and take notes of this. So this is Dave Emmons Show. It's syndicated through Odyssey Radio.live, and that's Eddie Carson's WDY Radio in Maryland. And Jay Hall he's been a terrific guest, and we hope that you take a look at his sites. And good night, everybody. And thank you very much, Jay.